All right, I am joined by another candidate in the 18th Congressional District race, Democrat Rob Mellon. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure being here.
So tell our viewers a little bit about yourself for those who don't know. Educator, small business owner, soldier.
That's correct. Well, I'm an Illinois guy. I was born and raised in Quincy. Spent my whole life there for the most part. I went to school there. I attended Quincy University, which is a Franciscan university right there in Quincy. But after I graduated, I joined the Army. And that's the only time I really hadn't lived in Illinois. And me and my wife traveled around the country. I was in all kinds of different locations from one coast to the other, actually. At one point, we moved from Monterey, California to upstate New York. So we bounced around, and we had a small family at the time. And we decided at the end of my active service that we should come back to Illinois. Our family was here, and it was really important for me, for my children to be around my grandparents who were still alive at the time, and then also my parents, because my grandparents were so important to me. I wanted my children to have that experience as well. And so when I came back to Quincy, I became a teacher, and I've been doing that since I owned a small business for a little while, but then I became a teacher, and that's what I've been doing for the last 13 years.
So how has your experience shaped who you are, and how has that led to this congressional run?
Well, I think it's important, my personal experience in the military, in this particular circumstance, when we've had the resignation of Aaron Schock, it's brought with real clarity the need for honor and integrity in this seat, in the Congress in general. And so for me, I've lived with this a very strict code of ethics my entire life, especially in my military service. And as an Army officer, you know, I've dedicated myself and taken an oath to integrity and honor, and that's exactly what I would like to bring to this position.
So give us the elevator pitch, why you to represent the 18th
You know, you get this
district.
question a number of times, and sometimes it's stated like, what are you, crazy? You know, like, what are you doing? But to be honest, it's about service for me, and I think about my family, and I think about my grandparents a lot. And my two grandfathers, our Grandpa Mellon was a farmer most of his life. Really no nonsense, nose to the grindstone, but a good and decent guy. And my Grandpa Ernie was this gregarious, life of the party type of individual. And I looked at it and I said, okay, so both of these guys, different sets of skills, but they ended up in the same economic condition. And I really believe the deck was stacked against them and against a lot of Americans. When we look at the current level of income inequality in the country, it's pretty alarming. It hasn't been this rate since 1928. And following that, we had the Great Depression, the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And so we see those levels of inequality today. And there's a lot of pressures on the middle class. You know, so for me, it's my job, because of the people I grew up with, like my grandfathers, to do the best I can to alleviate the burdens on the middle class and allow them to thrive and prosper like they had in the 50s and 60s and 70s when the middle class was growing and expanding.
A lot of eyes have been on the Supreme Court lately, and we've had some big decisions, and among them is the King-Burwell Obamacare subsidies decision. Where do you stand on the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I support the Affordable Care Act because I support health care reform. It's important to remember where we were at before health care reform even took into effect. We had almost 50 million people who didn't have health insurance. Now, I know it's pretty divisive. In a lot of cases, it's not the components of the plan that people are against, it's just the plan in general. It gets really politicized. If you break it down into its core components, for example, almost 90% of Americans support giving small businesses some sort of tax breaks or credits to help provide insurance for their workers. That's over 90%. Of course, that's part of the plan. And in closing the Medicare Part D donut hole, almost 90% supported that. And so that gives our seniors an opportunity where they're excluded or couldn't afford their medications before. It helps them out in that regard. And then pre-existing conditions. You know, there were a lot of policies in the past which were more affordable, but they weren't good policies because you could get kicked off if you got sick. It had caps, annual caps, and lifetime caps. And so these were parts of the proposal that a lot of Americans accept. If there are other parts of the plan, you know, it doesn't get rolled out in its entirety until 2022. So there's time to work on things that maybe, or tweak things that weren't working effectively. And those things that we know the American people want, we can keep and expand and protect the Americans and starting in a situation where we get full health care coverage in the country.
You mentioned taxes as they relate to the Affordable Care Act, but it's something that we really don't think about that often until tax time rolls around, but it's an issue that Congress has grappled with. Americans complain about every April. Is there a way to simplify our tax code that you see, whether it's personal or for corporations or across the board?
Well, I mean, if you just look at the deficit in general, I mean, there's obviously the government spends more than it's taking in and has since 2001, and then there's the little respite there, but before that they were spending more than they were taking in terms of revenue as well. So we know this has always been an issue, you know, historically. I think there needs to be some sort of fundamental change in the tax code. The middle class is bearing too much of a burden. When we had the Simpson-Bowles commission that talked about deficit reduction, it says tax on the middle class is what can depress the economy. So I'm not in favor of raising the taxes on the middle class in any way. But at the very top end of the tax structure, where a lot of the profits have gone in the last, certainly within the last decade, there are ways to increase levels to historic levels that had been there before, just on the very top of the tax bracket. Not invasive, but minor, that add some more revenue, so we can couple that with some reforms and fix our deficit and our debt issues.
I'm going to fire some topics at you now,
Sure.
and they're not easy questions necessarily, but do your best to kind of hit the nail on the head if you can. Military experience, so you've had experience with weapons, guns. Is it too easy in this country for the most dangerous people in America to get their hands on guns?
I mean, that's always a question. You know, for me, I think we do have ample gun laws. Sometimes the enforcement is not there, so the funding is not provided for the enforcement. So I think if there were proper funding, some of those laws could be more effective. Now, in the terms of, I would not be in a favor of like a registration, but if we had a case where you did background checks, I would certainly support something like that. And I know there was a Toomey Manchin bill that had been put forward and it didn't succeed, but I think I could fall in line with something like that. But overall, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, people's right to bear arms, and I wouldn't want to take that away.
As a military man, do we need more boots on the ground when it comes to the fight against terrorism and ISIS specifically?
Well, this is one that I've talked about, and it gives me, I have a perspective on this that no other candidate does. And so if we look at ISIS, ISIS actually is a multi-layered threat, but there's two main focus to ISIS, and one of them is this international terrorist threat. Al-Qaeda in the last 10 years has been degraded pretty significantly. It still exists, but a lot of their commanders and so forth have been eliminated. What filled that void was ISIS as an international terrorist organization. But we have to remember that ISIS also has a very regional power base. And what happened after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime was the Shia took control of the government, the Sunni were ostracized, the Maliki government took over, and the Maliki government, because the Sunni had run the government for so long, didn't have any professionals to help them run the government, and the Maliki government pretty much failed. And so then the ISIS comes in and positions itself as the protector of the Sunni. And as an extension of that, it's throughout the whole area, so it spreads over into Syria and to other places. So ISIS has a very regional hold, a very regional objective in protecting the Sunni. And I think within the Middle East, those countries have to solve that issue themselves. I don't think boots on the ground. It could provide stability because that's what happened in Iraq when the American forces were there in great numbers. But really it was just keeping those different groups, there's 3 major groups in Iraq, keeping them separated from one another. Once the American forces left, it devolved into the situation we have today. So what you have is an American force that could provide some security, but not fix any of the long-term political and religious issues that have been going on in some cases for centuries.
So we're running out of time here, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about education. Common Core is obviously a divisive issue across the country, but there probably should be a way, right, to gauge performance across the board for American students, whether they be in California or Illinois or New York. So your experience in the classroom, how has that shaped your thoughts on how we evaluate student performance and how we fund our schools?
Well, if you look at Common Core, I think it starts with an admirable goal. And the goal is to give our students the skills they need to compete in the new global economy. And so the higher thinking skills, critical thinking, that's going to be needed. More skilled type of jobs are going to be needed in the future. And so Common Core was directed in that fashion. But the challenge then becomes, how do you assess it properly? Now, if you do any assessment and it's focused on anything other than student achievement and measurement, then I think it's misguided. And the other problem with the Common Core testing that we've experienced in our school is when the Common Core has to be done on a computer, for example, and it ties up a lot of the computer and technology resources. It tied up our library for a long period of time this year, and it's just the nature of the test itself. So I have a problem with the way that the test is administered. But overall, I like the idea of giving the students, our students, the skills they need to compete in the global economy.
All right, so if people want to learn a little bit more about you, how can they do that?
Well, we have all the social media. I mean, you can go to Mellon for Congress on the Facebook, on my Facebook page, and it has update information all the time. My website is robmellon.com. I'm throughout the district. I'm knocking on doors today and throughout this entire period of time until the election. So I'll be around, and I hope you come out to see me.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for watching. Rob Mellon is a Democratic candidate for the 18th Congressional District. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.